Fast forward that to today's sort of mobile learning direct relationship with a device, you're able to build a very data-rich picture of the learning that's going on within an organization.
That was the voice of Raal Harris, Chief Creative Officer of Ocean Technology Group. This is another episode that focuses on the lifeblood of our industry, the mariners. If you want to learn more about the evolution of at-sea training and how we went from VHS tapes, which is what we used when I was sailing, to a full digital suite of learning tools, this is the episode for you, so stay tuned. Before we get to the show, don't forget to follow the podcast. If you're not sure where that is, that's the plus button, generally to the top of each show or the podcast itself, and just click on that. And don't forget, if you're so inclined, give a 5-star rating. All of it helps. Now on to the podcast.
Welcome, everyone, and you are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. Today's guest is Raal Harris, Chief Creative Officer at Ocean Technologies Group. Ocean Technologies Group provides maritime professionals across the globe with digital learning, assessment, maritime HR, and fleet management solutions. Today, we're going to talk to Raal about digitization and how it's played a role in the evolution of the many aspects of what OTG covers, with a focus around the seafarers. Raal, thank you for coming on this podcast.
It's great to be here, Chris. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, well, Raal and I met back earlier in the year at the CMA convention. It was great. He was on a panel. And he was fantastic, and I thought as I was sitting on that panel, he would be great to kind of share his thoughts coming from the creative side and with a group that covers many aspects. So, talk to us today about what you're up to with what the focus is and what's going on with the Ocean Technologies Group.
Yeah, sure, Chris. I think give you a bit of background that sort of makes sense of it, really. So my background in this industry goes back just nearly 20 years in maritime e-learning. So experience of really building resources and technology to help seafarers meet sort of compliance targets and develop skills around sort of being well trained and so on, and came into this group really creating Ocean Technologies Group from a merger from the company that I was with and was running, which was Videotel Marine International, and a company called Seagull Maritime from Norway, who were the big sort of competitors in that space. And that's really what kicked off the start of what became Ocean Technologies Group, as we brought some other brands into as well. And so the focus at the beginning was very much around maritime training, particularly around e-learning, digital learning. Both businesses really focused on that rather than on face-to-face training. And then with the addition of the Compass brand, which was a sort of crew management, really a maritime HR, a Terra Marine business, which was in the fleet management space. So HSEQ and planned maintenance, those kind of things coming into it. So it's a much broader remit today, but all fundamentally around sort of enabling maritime professionals, whether they're people on shore or whether people on the ships, to really kind of to go about their work and to operate ships sort of safely, efficiently, and increasingly focused on sort of sustainability as well. In terms of my role there, I mentioned I was running Videotel previously, but once we sort of formulated the group around a single CEO, I took on the creative director role, really, essentially. So it was my responsibility to build the brand, to deal with the outreach with the industry. So I look after all the marketing, and I work closely with the product team to really make sure we're making the things that the industry needs, and then out there in the various industry groups, talking about what we do and listening to what's going on and taking that back into the business.
One of the things you mentioned is kind of, a theme, a thread that runs along this podcast as well as the industry is sustainability. That must be, encompassing a lot of the projects that you're working on right now. It just must be around sustainability and reporting and making sure that, for the seafarers that work on the ships to understand that what they're doing from that point of view to the employability of a vessel, there's a direct line there.
I think the sustainability picture has changed quite a lot. The focus is there's always been a very strong environmental focus, really, to the underpinning legislation. So things like MARPOL and that kind of thing, and then energy efficiency through SEEMP and stuff like that. It's always been part of it. But I think it's the environmental stuff has been, either sort of ocean care or energy efficiency. That's largely been it. And I think that has changed to, and as you say, the reporting side of that has been very, there's mandatory reporting, but then there's also sort of stuff that would go into, say, ISO standards and those kind of things, those differentials. Increasingly that picture has changed to be much broader. And particularly when you start thinking about the S in ESG, it's become more and more a part of the conversation. So how we treat our seafarers, how we create good places to work so that people can thrive and so on. And that's becoming just as important as some of the sort of basic safety stuff, really, certainly for some of our bigger customers who are really concerned or not, really focused on their ESG performance. Yeah, for sure.
I mean, the E part is I think, like you said, notably, I think, is very not easy to get, but that's the focus of people. But the S and the G, the governance, I think to some point, probably, there is a level of governance on the vessel, but certainly that's probably more in any sort of trading that you would do for shoreside folks. But realistically, the S part, especially with, we've seen all these reports, about harassment at sea and assault at sea and those sort of things. I mean, that's a real big item, and we could talk about that a little bit later about why would you tell somebody to join our industry? You have to focus on all that picture. You can't be the greenest ship in the fleet and have a terrible workspace, right? I mean, it probably doesn't work, and there's probably a correlation there, but you could have a case of that and don't want to do that. Talking about your role and the company's role has always been around delivering training digitally or remotely. How has that changed since you started what you were doing and then evolving into what Ocean Technology is doing? Has there been a fundamental change? Can you talk us through a little bit of that, especially with the challenges that you see with dealing with that? And do you still see people like resistance to digital training?
There's a lot of dimensions there that we can pick out. I mean, I should say as well that in bringing those two big companies together, Videotel and Seagull, we're talking about a pretty large portion of the world fleet that's using our solutions today as Ocean Technologies Group, and so we are privileged to have some of the biggest owners and operators using, and so consequently we've got a very good data footprint and a good understanding of how lots of different companies are working with it. So I sort of flatter myself that I speak from some sort of authority on the kind of digital learning space and how that's kind of work and how that's evolved. And I think that if we look at the sort of story of how e-learning and shipping has evolved, I think it helps us to understand sort of where we are today. When it started out, we were talking about a box of VHS tapes which would get dropped on the ship, and I think and that was sort of how people dealt with a lot of the remote training needs, and that kind of evolved from there into sort of that being developed digitally. So a box of digital files which are being played in the ship, and that then evolves into sort of something that's more like a proto learning management system, and then up to sort of enterprise level software that's kind of you've got competency management, you've got mobile learning, all those sorts of things. But along that journey, the fundamental thing that changes is when you start to collect data and you start to be able to schedule that. So you all sit and watch a video, unless you wrote that down in a book in the old days, you wouldn't have a record that training event had taken place. Fast forward that to today's sort of mobile learning, direct relationship with a device, you're able to build a very data-rich picture of the learning that's going on within an organization. And, I think that for me is the key differential. It's like, are people actually still using it like a digital box of videos, or are they actually embracing a kind of a digitized world in which they're actually kind of analyzing that learner behavior? Are they actually thinking about how a digital learning fits into their organization and is part of their journey to transform what they do? And I'd say it was a very mixed picture out there. There are people out there who are still pretty much using it like that old box of videos, and others who are saying, what do I want to achieve as an organization? Where do we want to be? What kind of experience do I want people to have? How am I thinking about succession planning? How am I making sure that I'm developing people and I'm creating the people that I need for tomorrow and that kind of thing. And certainly a good portion of the customers are doing that as well. So it's really the distinction of I guess, of how far people are along that journey. The other thing to say is that, where there comes a digital record, there is an element of transparency there as well, in that, it's proving what you're doing. And I think that there are still some people out there who would prefer not to have to kind of report that and have that evidence. But increasingly, we're seeing, charterers, that kind of thing. People want to see that evidence. When you talked about ESG reporting and the governance bit, the big part there is really, how are you proving what you say you do? Everyone will say that they're, oh yes, we love sustainability and diversity and all that, but what are you actually doing? What data points can you point to and say, this is the upward trend that I'm seeing in my organization, this is what I'm measuring and managing? So I think it's becoming increasingly the norm that people have a digital training strategy, and whether they, to a certain extent, whether they like it or not, they know that they need to have it. Where there is still sort of reluctance, I think there is still a perception that certain things can't be done digitally, that there is a certain amount of dependency on, face-to-face. And I quite often, surprise people when I get into that, because I quite often say, yeah, a blended solution is the right way. But I think, there are going to always be some things which are done better done face-to-face, and there will always be some things that benefit from having and bringing people together. But I think that in the lifetime that I've spent in this, the better the technology gets, the more things can be covered or underpinned by a digital strategy. So if you take something like simulation, that was always, when I started out, that was not something we could do at all. It was like, you would have some underpinning knowledge, and then people would physically have to go to a simulator. Well, do people still need to go to a physical simulator? Yes, to do a full bridge mission, to actually have that experience where they're working together in a space. Yes. But in between now, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that can happen through cloud simulation or through gamified technology that bridges the gap between those two things and maximizes the experience that when people do get together. So when it comes to soft skills, when it comes to, leadership skills, these are still things that are predominantly best served face-to-face, but technology is increasingly making it possible to get a little bit further along the line, building competency without necessarily bringing people together. So I think the barriers are coming down now.
You talk about videos and stuff. I remember, because I started off at sea, it was always the back training and safety videos, right? That was one of the first things I remember. And then some lifeboat training and things like that. And certainly, it was all a logbook entry, maybe, or maybe a safety log. You would have a safety minutes on the ship, and then the captain would type them up, or the third mate, me, type them up, and then they would get put into an envelope and sent to the home office. In my case, it was Mobil Oil in Fairfax, Virginia, and Peggy, the crewing lady, would take it. Yep, good. Put it in the file, and that was the beginning and the end of it. And certainly one of the things that you also touched on, and certainly this is interesting, is I had some folks on from Kongsberg Maritime and Digital, and she was saying that same type of problem with the simulators, especially, like, you could do a lot of pre-learning before you even get to the simulator. And that is something that the industry actually embraces, because and this is my next question is, because it seemingly can give seafarers a little bit more time, they're not off the ship and then going to a simulator. They're off the ship and maybe going to a simulator, but for a shorter period of time. What's your, the seafarers, as you talk to them, how are they reacting to what you're offering, and just, training overall and moving that into the digital world?
The first point, I think, is one about flexibility. That there's a sort of, occasionally people challenge the amount of the training that seafarers need to do, and and of course it's difficult with the working lives that they have. But I think once you actually start to kind of pick at that, the idea that we can get by without doing training, that doesn't really stand up. We need people to have access to, it's our responsibility to make sure that people have access to training and feel confident that they know what they're doing. So then the discussion becomes around, well, what is the best way of doing that to minimize the burden on the seafarer. And so the more, I think, options and agency we give them in terms of how they do that, I think the better. So I think certainly when it comes to the ability to sort of to make use of or for them to choose when and how they do the training, certainly makes it a lot easier. So yes, it's difficult to find time on board the ship, but then given that, compared to having to go to a training center when they're on their leave period and be away from their families and stuff like that, they're very into that. So having that ability to sort of do stuff remotely certainly is something that they enjoy, and we get lots of feedback along those sorts of lines. When you start to talk about like what is the seafarer's response to the training that we offer them and how they do it, I would say that it's pretty much divided between those who understand and see that it's contributing to their professionalism and to their development of skills, versus those who sort of see it as a bit of a burden. Overwhelmingly, we see that they're positive to that, because they're very motivated, seafarers generally, to get those better jobs, to acquire those skills, to be more employable and to rise up the ranks. But there are certainly people out there who do consider it as a burden and something that they shouldn't have to do, and that's really down to the company's culture and how the company set things up. And if you look at things like competency management, for example, where you're actually being transparent with people about what they're doing is contributing to their profile to be available for promotion, for example, and you see a very, very different picture there. So we try to encourage people to it's not good enough to just throw training at people. I think you have to provide, if you want people to respond well, they have to see it in context. They have to understand how it benefits them and how it relates specifically to the jobs and tasks that they're doing, because otherwise they see it out of context. It just becomes another thing that they have to do, that they're not engaged with.
Yeah, another burden, another box to check from the mothership, so to speak. And why am I bothering with this? I'm a very good second mate, bosun, whatever.
Yeah,
I can see that, for sure.
Well, one of the other things that you mentioned there, which is really interesting when you look at the way the profession is developing, I think that sometimes seafarers come at this and say, well, hang on a minute, I've got my COC, I'm competent, I'm already competent, that's it, why am I being asked to do this extra stuff? And I think when we think about the way our industry is evolving, the acceleration of change, I think we need to change that perception. All of us, it's not just a seafaring problem. I think all of us need to accept that we need to develop new skills and knowledge as we go through our careers, because things are, we can't possibly be front loading a whole of our education and expecting to learn nothing new. Things are changing at such a pace that we all need to get on board with this idea that we're constantly acquiring new skills and new knowledge. And I think that's an important thing for seafarers to understand about the COC, that it's the starting point now, but there will be additional things that need to be learned.
You bring up a really interesting point, because I think you can parallels to what's going on in emissions, right? And that, like, everybody says, well, IMO didn't do enough. And I kind of disagree, because I always tell people, well, listen, the way I look at it is that's the minimum. Like, if you want to be a really good company and, you want your ships up to be chartered at a higher level because you have better emissions, a higher CII rating, well, you could hit the minimum, but you need to do more. And more companies are going to look at that. And then that's on the individual level. Like, yes, I can meet the COC, but if I really want to get employed by a better company, make more pay, these are the types of things that I have to go above the minimum. And I think that that's very interesting, that it's also at the micro level, or the seafarers level, not, to diminish it, but looking at it, the macro being the ship and the company and earnings as a whole, and the micro level being the individual on that ship that contributes to everything else. So I think that's kind of interesting. Speaking of the minimums and everything, and one of the things that we talked a little bit before we started is, your role is, chief creative officer. You're out there. We were talking about your travels and everything else. One of the things that come up, and it comes up all the time in our industry, is the general and overall lack of of kind of our reputation, outside of our industry. How do you guys, because you have a great view, you deal with a lot of senior people, but yet what you do impacts the clients and impacts seafarers. How do you deal with that as somebody who has to be in the creative space and work with marketing and work with communicating with folks? How do you deal with that, and how do you think we can kind of change that and work together to improve that view?
Definitely anxiety at the moment around how we attract people into our industry and whether we can get that talent pipeline going. I think we've also seen, I think, I don't like to, keep going on about the pandemic. It's like we can't ever get away from it. But, we saw in that there was suddenly people understood how reliant they were on the seafarers, and we struggled, I think, as an industry to kind of get the focus where it needed to be on the understanding of seafarers as key workers and things like that. And that sort of seems to have woken everybody up really to this idea of what's our image and how are we projecting those two things, around. To a certain extent, my view is that shipping's brought this on itself. We've always been a bit happy to be in the shadows and to be secretive and not have people to have looked too much to us, and now we're sort of reaping the wind of that a little bit, in the sense that that we wonder why more people don't know what a fantastic place this is to work. It's a tremendous industry, and one that I've got an enormous amount of love and affection for. And how do we change that image problem and start to kind of get more people interested in a career at sea? Of course, at the same time, we've also had a few things that have that have negatively impacted the image of shipping. I think, for example, the seafarers being at sea during that pandemic period of 13 months, and the mental health crisis that we're now acknowledging has existed, not just because of the pandemic, there's lots of other issues with that as well going back. So it's a tricky one. And then when we think about how we solve that problem, I think it's a very difficult problem for an individual company to solve. The individual company may have a recruitment issue, but they're not able to solve the attraction to the industry problem on their own. So it's necessary that we get together. And there are some good initiatives, there are good things happening. So I think, in terms of kind of how do we change that from a PR perspective, and really I think it's about engagement. It's about us getting out there. It's about us celebrating our successes, and it's about us talking about some of the great things that we're doing. I think the environmental thing we talked about a little bit is interesting as well, because there's some headline grabbing stuff around how much part of the emissions story shipping is, and the sixth biggest country if it was a country, and stuff like that. But if you actually look at shipping and what it contributes to actually being an efficient way of shipping goods around the world, and if you took the ships away and you started moving your goods any other way, the environmental picture would be considerably worse than it is today. So we need to kind of flip some of the way that we talk about this. When we start to think about the energy transition that's going ahead, I'm somebody that considers themselves to be very well connected, but it shocked me recently to see that shipping will have to move something like 50% of new energy around. So it's not only got a big part to play in terms of shipping being more efficient, but it's also key to actually being able to get a whole bunch of other industries to decarbonize as well, and actually get energy where it needs to be. So I think for me, when I look at the how we can play that role, and how motivating that is for a lot of young people to be part of that story, I think there's a massive opportunity for us to change perspectives there as well.
Just going back to your example of the percentage of kind of, the use, I think it's 3 or 3.5% of all the greenhouse gases comes from shipping. And what people don't understand is it still is the most efficient way by far. I was at a conference at SUNY Maritime. This was about 5 years ago. And it was focusing on America's Blue Highway, which is using the waterways systems in the United States more to take trucks off the road, things like that. And I forgot who it was. Somebody had I think it was Bob Kunkel. He had a graph up, and it said, like, okay, a truck can move 1 ton on 1 gallon of diesel. It was like 180 miles. That same gallon of diesel in a train can go like 200, 300 miles, right? that same gallon diesel for that same ton of cargo on a barge, inland waterway tug of barge was 800. I forgot what the graph was, but it was exponentially more than anything you could even imagine. I remember I was so struck by it. I actually took a picture of it, and it was just so amazing to see that and to realize that is the type of kind of relationship that it is, and that people don't realize that, yes, it is a single contributor, but also if you want to have a multi-trillion-dollar global economy, the only way it works is to have ships, because if you don't have ships, yes, you can move things like Ferraris and airplanes and gold on airplanes, but there's really not a lot beyond those high priority, high value items. Yeah. But I think but I think that's it's communicating that. I always think about the thousands and thousands of port calls a day around the globe that this industry undertakes, where nobody gets hurt, ship goes into the port, pilot gets on smoothly, they hand the shipmaster a newspaper, they have a cup of coffee, they bring it in, they bring it out, tugboats come alongside, tugboats leave, cargo in and out. Happens every day. And being a native New Yorker, the other day I drove by the port of New York, New Jersey, and there's 1,000 things going on all at the same time, seemingly pretty uneventful, right? And I think we need to do a better job of communicating that.
Well, yeah, the other point that I'd make is one that I think sometimes gets overlooked as well, is that if you want to think about an industry that's a true meritocracy and that actually transforms people's lives, you've got to look to shipping. It's incredible. Some of the poorest people in the world have had their fortunes completely changed by this industry, and where else can you as a young person end up with a $300 million asset that you're driving, you're piloting?
Yeah, I always said, when I used to, when I was sailing, I was working on coastwise tankers, and, it was basically a small MR. So 38,000 tons of gasoline, times how many, barrels times how many gallons, driving around with enough fuel for we used to go to Florida for Fort Lauderdale for a week, right? So there was a lot of interesting kind of and you got there pretty fast, right? 4 years of school, and then I spent a little while as an AB, but within 5 years I'm doing that after coming out of nowhere, basically. So it's interesting. That brings us to a good thing. Next question. I love to ask folks this, and you kind of touched upon it a little bit, but what would you say if you had somebody that you knew was kind of thinking about coming in the industry, even on the creative side, on the marketing side, not even necessarily on the seafaring side, but what would you say to that person? Maybe somebody from university who's considering an internship with your group. What would you say to them to kind of say, look, this is where you should be, and you should build your career?
Well, I think it's a fantastic industry. I think it's one that I mentioned, about it being a meritocracy. I think the other things that are really great about it is we have difficult problems to solve here. This is one of the things that everything is slightly more difficult. If you look at the maritime e-learning space, for example, compared to the wider e-learning industry, you've got that problem of not always, connectivity being patchy or being on, you need an online and offline model, you need a fallback, getting content where it needs to be. These are all challenging things to do. And, there's a lot of technical challenges. I've worked with a lot of software engineers who are like, oh my God, this is terrible. And others who get really excited about the fact that they've got these additional constraints to overcome. So I think that's a part of it. I think it's a truly global business. I think if you like people and you like different cultures and you like to hear different stories, and I think but fundamentally it's a people business, and I think people who like people get on well in this industry. You make friends very, very quickly in the shipping industry. Your reputation counts for a lot. It's global, but it's very, very small, and people will always be able to introduce you to somebody, and you're never on your own. I think you can go to a shipping event on your own. You won't be on your own for long. You make friends really quickly, and people look out for one another, because I think there's a lot of people. You mentioned you were a seafarer yourself. I think there's a lot of people who know what it's like to be a stranger in a strange land, and will kind of look after you. So I think it's a combination of all those things, plus a little romance of the sea.
Yeah, I think a little bit of that, and I think it still is, as much as it's regulated, it isn't. There is a lot of it that isn't regulated. Shipbroking is not regulated. And I know that other brokerages are, right. Shipbroking is not regulated, and there's part of that aspect of kind of being a little bit of the Wild West. I do think for sure the whole idea of knowing people and meeting, seeing somebody. I mean, just if you go to any of the big events, for example, last year I went to Posidonia, and I'm sitting. This is a true story. I'm sitting and we're talking to a client. We're in one of the, the big hall there. If anybody hasn't been, it was the first year that I actually went to the conference. So sitting in the big hall and near one of the little cafeterias at cafe, we're just having a coffee with somebody. And I see out of the corner of my eye, a bunch of younger folks, and they had a SUNY Maritime backpack. And I'm like, so I go over, and that's my alma mater. I go, excuse me, you guys are, yeah, we're graduate students. I go, oh, I graduated in 1994. Like literally, they're like, oh, wow, okay, like this is completely random, but it is, like you said, it's a small industry. You try to look out for people. And I think going back to your other point about talking to, let's say, developers, because my role is product management, I talk to a lot of developers, the whole Scrum and Agile and all that stuff. And talking about a challenge, there are a lot of challenges. We have several products. Again, this is not a pitch, but we have several products, not my thing, but that we deal with where there is an offline and online format, right? And you have to deal with that. One of the things that came up, I interviewed somebody, Yuri Hart, on the cybersecurity side, and Yuri said, we still have ships that have Windows 7. So you're dealing with that. So you have to be able to implement stuff that's dealing with an old operating system. Well, how do we deal with that? From whether it's the security side or implementing some sort of forms like we do, or the training that you guys do. That's a challenge, because you think, oh no, everybody here is on a current version of Windows or what have you, and you got ships running around. And I think it was some number like a quarter, 20%, like some ridiculous amount of ships where they have that. And that's certainly, if you look to somebody who's looking for a challenge, it's there. So that's what I try to tell folks. As we get to the conclusion, I always like to ask this question, and I've changed it up over the years. So, fictional hero. Do you have a fictional superhero or hero or someone that you look up to? We've had some interesting answers, and I'm curious to hear what you think about that.
Well, I was very into comics and superheroes and stuff when I was younger, and I thought about your question there, and I think the one that I always liked was this one, Hawkeye. He was the kind of archer guy. His parents were killed in an accident or something, and he learned to join a circus or something, and he was firing arrows. He could amazingly accurate with the arrows or whatever, and I think that he's the one that always stuck in my mind. And I just thinking about it, occurred to me that he doesn't have any kind of superpowers. You know what I mean? He's just a guy who worked really hard at something and got really, really good at it. So I think I was always attracted to those kind of people that you could aspire to be. You could never be Superman, but maybe if you worked hard enough, you could get as good at shooting arrows as Hawkeye, maybe.
For me, it was always James Bond. I guess that's why I didn't want to become a spy, but like you mentioned, we have a very semi-romantic industry where we can hop around and go to cocktail parties. Yeah. And, try to look fancy, but for some people it works more than others. So maybe that's the romanticism.
International man of mystery.
There we go.
Mystery.
International man of mystery. What are you doing? I'm going to Hamburg for beers. There's no mystery of that, but that's what I'm doing. So
I think when I talk to my friends about my travel schedule, I think some of them actually think I am a spy.
Maybe, but I can tell you when I talk to my travel schedule, when I tell people years ago, when I was a shipbroker, the Parisian shipbrokers, there was a community there. They would do the Parisian shipbroker week, and it was like 2 days, 3 days of just parties. You start at like lunch, and then 2 days. And I would tell people, oh, well, are you going to Paris? This is important business meetings. No, I'm going for cocktail parties. So like that part of the business, I mean, is very attractive, I think, because it's not like, oh, if I don't make this sale, I don't have a job. No,
Yeah.
it's, because it's all based on relationships, which is an attractive thing for sure.
Yeah, indeed. And I think however digital it becomes, I think your address book in this industry is always going to be the most, that's your real superpower, I think.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head. Your name and reputation really precede you, and I think that was something that, like, actually my grandfather always said, and he said the only thing you have is your name, and I think in this industry, it's tenfold, right? If you have a good reputation and a solid person, you can, if you need something, you can usually find somebody who can help you out without a lot of sweat. So. Anyway, it was a pleasure to speak with you. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast. I do appreciate it, and have a good fall and good rest of your travels there. And I hope nobody mistakes you for a spy.
Thanks, Chris. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.